Hello everybody, my name is Irina. I'm a GP ST3 in London, and today I'm going to talk to you about how to prepare for your CSA. Now this video is quite a heavy video. There's a lot of detail because whenever you ask someone how they prepped or when they started prepping for their CSA, you get really vague answers like, oh, a few months before, just do loads of role plays, and actually that doesn't give you very much. So I've been really nitty gritty about my detail, hence making it quite a long video. Maybe try and split it with the different sections, that might work better. Everyone revises in different ways. With me, I had quite young children, so I thought I will go for a longer approach but with less intensity. You may be a last minute crammer, so don't feel you need to take absolutely everything from what I say, but I do hope this video gives you a few tips and strategies really to deal with how you're going to prepare for your CSA. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about my revision timeline. I am going to discuss who I revise with, how I revise, and then we'll talk about courses and books that you might find useful. So to begin with, I started revising about 5-ish months before my exam, and what I would do is half a day every week. Our VTS teaching was one morning or afternoon, and I would come in either before or after VTS teaching and sit down and do role plays with one of the other VTS trainees. As we got closer to the exam, we started adding in one evening a week for a few hours, and then I'd say the last 6 weeks before the exam we ended up adding in a weekend day, so a full day Saturday or a full day Sunday where we do 5 or 6 hours of quite intense revision. So as you can see, the actual intensity does build up, and that's important because if you start off full on, then you might find yourself burning out. So I think pace yourself and have a plan in mind. In terms of the few days before the exam, I took about 3 days study leave, and those were like going into surgery, starting at 9, finishing at 5, and just doing full days of revision. I would say the day before the exam we did a slightly more relaxed schedule, and that was just so you didn't burn out and you weren't too exhausted on the day of the exam itself. Now in terms of who I revised with, so I had a revision buddy that I revised with from the beginning all the way up to the exam. We were both sitting the exam at the same time, and it worked really well for us. She was also someone who had a young child, so we were really sort of flexible with our timetables. We did a lot of FaceTime and Skype sessions if things became difficult, and yeah, it really worked. A lot of people would suggest having 3 people, so one person is doctor, one person's patient, and one person's observer. And yes, that probably can work. It's not a bad way of doing things. I probably wouldn't go over 3 people in any revision session because you really need time to practice, and once you start adding more and more people in, that opportunity to really test the way you're going to behave in a CSA exam gets less and less. The only sort of disadvantage I see to having a 3 people is you get a third less stations to practice with, so they're the ones you're going to be observing, and so you get slightly less yield. Also, I don't know what everyone else is like, but our revision timetable was it was very flexible. Adding another person's revision timetable onto ours would have been difficult, so just really planning was a lot easier with 2 people than 3 people. But see what works with you, works for you. What I would say is you do need to have someone you're going to revise with, and that someone should share some common goals. So firstly, you need someone who you really gel with, and that's important because you're going to spend a considerable amount of time with this person, your evenings or your free time closer up to the exam. So really someone that you get along with well, and that you revise well with. The second thing is, and I found this more when I was helping other sort of trainees when they were revising, their revision buddy would be sitting the exam before or after their own exam. So October sittings, they're the person they're revising with is not planning to sit until December. And I'm not sure in practice that works very well, because you're on completely different wavelengths, and it is important that the person you revise with sort of can build up their intensity at the same time that you're building up yours. And I just feel that it's not in sync unless you're planning towards a common goal. So I would probably start asking friends or other VTS trainees when they're planning to sit, and join a group that way, so you're kind of all working towards one particular deadline. Apart from my revision buddy, I don't think there's anyone I haven't revised with, and that's important, because every time you revise with a new person, you get an absolutely new perspective on how you're coming across and how you might approach certain situations, and that anxiety when you revise with someone new sort of peaks. So with my revision buddy, I could easily tell, if at some point, if she was, hiding information, she wanted me to prompt her more, or what sort of seemed to provoke her when we were doing scenarios. And you don't have the luxury of doing that if you're revising with someone else and someone new. And I think that's important. So I revised with there was a salaried GP at our practice who had recently set the CSA. I revised with him. I revised with another VTS trainee who was planning to sit their CSA a few months later. I revised with my training program director, who I thought would give me good educational context. I revised with my educational supervisor, my revision buddy's educational supervisor. I revised with a husband who probably knows more about ICE than I do at this stage. So really, you just revise with absolutely everybody, because you just get so much more fluent in the way you're approaching things, and you can't get that any other way apart from doing it with different people. And also it's probably more reflective what your CSA will be like, because every actor is different, and if you have revised with so many people, that anxiety of practicing with someone new starts to disappear, because it becomes a much more mechanical thing of just being able to follow whoever that patient might be. So that's who I revise with, and now let's talk about what you do. So all of these sessions really were role play based, and what I did on my half day session that I started off with 5 months ago was we would cover a system. So we'd go, this week let's do cardiology cases, and we sort of focus on whatever the cardiology cases were. Following week we'd do RESP, the week after we'd do gastro, etc, etc. So we did it sort of system-based revision, and they were all role plays. We added a few other systems on, so the ones that I remember that we added on were things like genetics, things like ethics, so that covers things like driving, confidentiality, all the sort of GMC related things, and then I think the other one we added on was things like health promotion and lifestyle, so explaining stop smoking, weight loss, all of those kind of diet ones, all of those things that are probably quite important. And I pretty much did role plays as my basic amount of revision. In terms of what else I did, and it really isn't very much more than that. So I did some notes, and I'm not talking about reels and reels of papers going through things. What I'm talking about is literally what I did is I noticed that I struggled with management, and not exactly not knowing what to say, but how to tailor that for the patient in front of me. So what I would do is have a one-liner to explain what a condition was. And this is important, because although you understand all the pathophysiology of conditions, being able to break it down in its most simplistic format is really important. And I will come back to this in another video when we talk about management. But essentially, I had a one-liner that I could use, and it would be an easy spiel for me to come out with. So if, for example, I was talking to someone about having a high cholesterol reading, I would say something like, oh, okay, your blood test shows that there's high cholesterol. This means there is a higher number of fat cells in your body, and we are worried about that because that can lead to things like heart attack and stroke. And that is literally all the time you have. So having a one-liner for most common diagnoses was really helpful. And then what I did in my notes is I would just have a quick management plan. And I mean, I'm going right back to med school here. So I would have, you know, the ABC approach. It was literally conservative, medical, surgical. And I would have things, so for high cholesterol would be diet, you know, diet, exercise, weight, stop smoking, and medical be statin, and there's not really a surgical option, but basically I'd have that. So when I'm dealing with that sort of patient, I would have, you know, a nice sort of approach to how I was going to deliver my management to that patient, and that I found really useful. Did I make notes on guidelines? Is something someone asked me, and no, not really. I mean, I read through guidelines if I needed to, but really for the bread and butter. So, you know, things like hypertension, UTIs in children, or the fever guidelines in children, that sort of thing. But it was mainly, that was really the only note taking I was doing for that exam. And then the other ways that we revised was those last 3 days that I mentioned just before the exam, we were doing back-to-back mock examinations. So this is really important, because I don't think that I realised how exhausting the CSA can be. Like, literally you walk out of that building and you feel like you've been hit by a bus. It's absolutely tiring. And there is something different about doing back-to-back CSA questions than doing one case and then sitting down and going through feedback. You've got time to sort of recuperate from, you know, how awful it might have been. And back-to-back, you do not have the luxury of doing that. So it's quite physically exhausting, but also mentally. It's about keeping yourself in check and being able to move on from a station, and also mentally to go from, you know, one condition to another is an important part of developing. So I think especially, I mean, I think we did it too late. I would say a couple of weeks before the exam, I would try and do at least 6 cases back to back, then sit down and go through feedback after all of that. And you just find that your performance does vary once you start doing mock examinations. So those are the major things. Role plays, a few notes. The other thing that people ask me is, does it help when you're seeing patients? And I think it really depends on your patient cohort. If I iced some of my patients here, I'd get things like, oh, you're the doctor, you should know. So really, I think it really depends. What I do think helps is if you try and stay to a minimum of 15 minutes, then you do 10 minutes as you would a CSA case, but you have those last 5 minutes to really sort of go through and reflect over what you saw in that case. And if that means then you just read, you know, the patient leaflet you said you're going to hand it to the patient, and you now know what's in it, or you have a quick glance at the guidelines, and actually having seen a patient with a condition and then going through the information is a different type of learning, because it actually cements, and you can now sort of, you have a way of putting that diagnosis on a peg, you know, labelled by that patient, so you kind of remember it a lot better. So in that way, learning wise, I think it was really useful just to have those 5 minutes. I think, you know, try your management and your structure with your patients. Some of them may respond really well to it. So I think it really depends. But that's what I did with my patients when I was revising. So we've talked about revision timeline. We've talked about who to revise with, and we've talked about what sort of revision to do. Now I want to talk to you a bit about the infamous courses and books. And I don't know what it is about the CSA, but it seems to really encourage us to spend a huge amount of money on courses and books. And I think it's just one of those high stake exams where you feel like you just do not want to have an opportunity to fail. I remember when I told a friend of mine that I was sitting the CSA, and she literally gave me this massive wad of books. And in all honesty, I probably didn't go through any of them. I used one book and I went to one course. And I'll tell you a bit about that. So book-wise, I use this folder. I've got it with me today. I will put a link to it in the comments section, because I'm not sure how it works on this video. And what it has is each system. So when I said I started at the beginning 5 months ago and I was doing each system at a time, I was literally following the folder. So it has 3 role play cases on each system. So 3 on cardiology, 3 on RESP, and we'd do those 3 each week. At the front of each of those systems, it tells you common diagnoses, so the bread and butter of, you know, general practice. And in my notes I would just go through those diagnoses and add in my one-liner for each of those conditions. So not too taxing, and it worked really well. When I finished with these role plays, we then moved on to do the Pennine VTS role plays. If you haven't heard of that, it's a GP VTS program in the north, and essentially they have an amazing website and an array of like role play and cases that you can do. They do vary in how good they are, how useful they are, and how well written they are, and you'll see what I mean when you start to read them, but actually it's a fantastic resource, and I probably went through most of those. The other way we did cases is we started writing out our own cases nearer to the end, and someone mentioned doing that really early on when I was revising, and at the time I just thought, I don't have time for this, and I can't really understand why this would be useful. And actually it was fantastic writing your own cases, because it's a completely different style of learning, and when you start writing your cases you get a much more deeper context and understanding of the exam. So for example, if you're doing a case where you want one of your patients to present with an embarrassing problem, you start having to think, well, actually, what will be their presenting complaint? What will they come in with? And how will this lead to this, embarrassing problem? And once you start thinking like that, you suddenly start realizing where you meant to sort of probe a bit more and how you're going to get a bit more information. So I would really recommend it. If you've got the time, definitely write a few cases and see how those go down with your revision partners. So I think that was it for books. I did use one other thing. I used these, I don't have them on me, but they're RCGP case cards, and they're written by 4 trainees who are now doctors, but quite soon after they finish a CSA exam. And they literally, the notes that I talked about with the one-liner and how you're going to manage it, they did that. And you can see they all have different styles of doing it. And I use them mainly, I think I used 2 or 3 of the case cards really. One was for something like fibromyalgia, the other one for chronic back pain. So it was trying to find the wordings that I would use for the sort of more complex, difficult situations that you might encounter in the exam. I did flick through the other books, and essentially, and I have used them when I've been practicing with other trainees more recently, and essentially there's 2 types. So you get the role play based books, and those are really transcripts of different cases and how you should word things and what you should be saying. And the other one is knowledge based books with information about knowledge. I think the knowledge ones, things you can mostly get online, use at nice guidelines. I'm not sure they add anything much personally, but you may find them useful. The role play ones, the ones with the transcript, I really do not like these. I think, and I feel quite strongly against these, because mainly, having looked at some of them, they're really unnatural. So you need to find a way of explaining and managing problems in general practice that is natural to your style of doing management. When you see a transcript and you're literally trying to follow that word to word, it sounds unnatural. I think you probably would score much lower. And the amount of information in some of these transcripts, I wonder if, without being harsh, if they've ever sat a CSA exam, because it's not feasible to give that information unless you're speaking it 1,000,000 times an hour. So I think I would probably approach them with a bit of caution. In terms of courses, so I went to Nigel Guillem's course. It's called Mentor Consults, and as with the books and the link that I was going to put, I'll also put a link to his course, and I found it very useful. Some people say do the course really early on so you don't form bad habits. I'm not sure I agree with that. I think sort of closer to the exam might be more useful, but not too close. And the reason for that is at the beginning you just need to find your style, you need to become fluent, and what you really want a course to do is kind of make you that little bit more slick and change those sort of small niggles rather than trying to completely change your style. And I'm not sure you'd get the same value in a course early on. You could have probably done a lot of that legwork yourself. So I found his course really good. It had about 6 of us, which is a nice small number. We got four cases which we all did. So you saw a total of 24 cases. He used actors, and I thought it was a good course. I did consider I mean, I went to his course because a friend said to me, who had just done her CSA, go to Nigel Guillem's course, really good, so I booked it. So there wasn't a huge amount of thought involved behind it. I did consider the RCGP course. The benefit of that is it happens in the actual RCGP building, and there is something about walking into that building on the day of the exam and you can feel your heart thumping, and if you're someone who gets very anxious because of the situation, then I think that might be a good course to consider, because it removes the stress of being in a new place, and I think the actors are also the ones that do the actual CSA exam, so I think in terms of anxiety it can help allay a lot of the anxiety. The only disadvantage, I think, is there are larger numbers, so you don't get to practice more. It's over 2 days, and I think the first day is much more theory based, so I don't know how that works. Obviously the two that I'm talking about are London centric. I know there's lots out of London. There's a famous guy in the Midlands who does courses that a lot of people go to, but I can't really comment on those as I've never been. What I really think is, maybe go to one course, limit the number of books you're using, and just do the bread and butter of role play, because that is probably the most efficient way of revising for an exam, especially for this exam, and we spend hundreds of pounds on this exam. You don't need to spend the equivalent on getting all the paraphernalia associated with the CSA. So just practice. Next week I will cover structure and we'll talk about the first 5 minutes, and I wish you the very best of luck revising.